time now for our political panel. We're joined by Dr. Richard Denniss, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and Evan Mulholland, Director of Comms at the Institute of Public Affairs. Great to be with you both. It's been a bruising week for the Prime Minister. He says he doesn't care about leaked messages from Barnaby Joyce calling him a liar. Richard, what do you make of the tech saga?
Well, it's hardly a great start to the year for the Prime Minister, as you said. And for all those people who were worried that Grace Tame not smiling at him last week might have upset him or hurt his feelings, well, apparently being called a liar and a hypocrite has no impact on him. So at least we should take him at his word when it comes to his resilience. I think the real problem for the Prime Minister is that over the last 3 years, he's really developed a reputation as a man, as a leader, who doesn't ever finish anything he starts. He always kind of hopes that something else will come along and distract people from the inquiry he promised, the review he promised, the roadmap he announced. And COVID's caught up with him. And increasingly, as people think his grip on power is slipping away, people are willing to challenge him directly. And that's why these texts are leaking. That's why the pressure is building, because people think, well, now's the time to strike. So it's a very dangerous time for the Prime Minister.
Evan, do you agree with that? What are these text messages that keep coming out say about the Prime Minister and how he's regarded?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Richard there. There's a lot of issues to unpack here, from the leaked PVO text messages to the Barnaby Joyce text messages. Obviously not the kind of thing the government wants playing out right now. I mean, in the lead up to the 2013 election, the Liberals certainly had a lot of ammunition to play with people on the public record, Kevin Rudd's colleagues calling him all sorts of names. Those things are starting to add up for Scott Morrison and giving Labor a lot of ammunition in the lead up to the election campaign, but all from anonymous text, anonymous cabinet ministers, all behind the scenes. Now, I think some people regard Barnaby Joyce as a hypocrite, or say that he's a hypocrite. That could be true. But what Barnaby Joyce was really doing was passing on his thoughts as a disgruntled backbencher. Now, if you spoke to anyone in Canberra, you could hear from and talk. People would be talking about how Barnaby Joyce was disgruntled. Obviously, most backbenchers in Canberra are disgruntled with their leaders from time to time. He expressed his view in a private text message that he did not expect to leak. The difference between that and the PVO texts that were released at the press club is that this supposed federal cabinet minister authorised that leak at that time, and Barnaby Joyce was expressing his frustration at the leak of those text messages and the fact that this some would say cowardly federal cabinet minister happened to be putting it out there without revealing their identity. So it's certainly not a good start to the year for Scott Morrison.
Richard, surely you agree with that analysis as well, that there's a pretty distinct difference between PVO's text messages and the ones that Barnaby Joyce had that was leaked? And also, how damaging is this for Scott Morrison in the lead up to the election?
I think what's damaging for Scott Morrison is the pattern, whether it's Emmanuel Macron calling him a liar, whether it's former Prime Minister Turnbull calling him a liar, or his own colleagues in his cabinet, Gladys Berejiklian, and now, of course, Barnaby Joyce. I'm not sure I buy this idea that Barnaby never thought those texts would be seen by anyone else. The texts were... we don't know who they were to, but they were written to be passed on to Brittany Higgins. Let's be clear, at the time that the Prime Minister's office was accused of covering up the rape of somebody, Barnaby Joyce was reaching out to that person through an intermediary saying, well, I don't have her text, I don't have her phone number, so would you please pass this on? So it seems a bit odd that Barnaby Joyce is saying, I had no idea these text messages would be seen by someone else. He was sending them to an intermediary for them to be passed on to someone else. But really, that's irrelevant. Whether Barnaby Joyce actually believed Scott Morrison was a liar and a hypocrite, or was just pretending to believe that the Prime Minister was a liar and a hypocrite in order to curry favour with a critic of the Prime Minister, well, which is worse?
Okay, well, look, moving on. International tourists are expected to arrive shortly in Australia, or be allowed in, I should say. Evan, is this about time?
This is about time. We're seeing cases and hospitalisations now on the decline from the Omicron wave. But you've got to ask, with the amount of cases that we had over summer, what was the international border closure actually stopping? We've seen so much pain, so much anguish, especially in our tourism industry, that this has gone on for just too long. We've had this halfway house situation. We're allowing people come in from overseas. We're allowing parents of Australian citizens to come in from overseas, but not tourists. So Australia desperately needs more economic activity that this will provide, and you've got to ask why it wasn't done sooner.
Richard, do you think it's a good move?
Look, I think Evan's right in that the government's approach is entirely confused. I mean, of course, what's been happening is other countries are now advising their citizens not to come to Australia because Australia is a COVID hotspot. So we're right that having let it rip, having let the virus spread without the things in place for testing, without the booster shots in aged care, without all of the measures that we might have installed, having decided to let the virus rip across the eastern states at least, the arrival of people from overseas was never going to be the main cause of infection here in Australia. But there's nothing consistent about the federal government's approach to COVID. I mean, of course, a year ago, the Prime Minister was saying, let's not rush the vaccine rollout. In his own words, he said, he'd rather do it slowly and safely than rush it. And then, of course, by the end of the year, he was blaming everybody else for a slow rollout. So whether it's international borders, whether it's his recent, presumably Poland-inspired change of heart in West Australia, the position on tourists doesn't really make any epidemiological sense. But I think it's a long time since we heard the Prime Minister say he was listening to the experts.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but just quickly, Evan and Richard. Evan, I'll start with you first. What are your thoughts on ScoMo backing WA Premier Mark McGowan's stance on having a hard border?
Yeah, I'm lost for words on this one, but it continues really a pattern that we've seen over this last term of government, that Scott Morrison doesn't lead debates. He's prepared to sit back and sniff the wind and wait for the debate to happen, and then decide which way he's going to go based on polling or focus groups or whatever. And that seems to be what he's done here. And it continues a pattern where he's not willing to lead debates. He waits until there's a lot of noise, like against vaccine mandates, and comes out against states for endorsing them, which is quite rightly. But then only a couple of weeks later, we'll punt out Novak Djokovic out of the country. So it continues a pattern we've seen where Scott Morrison is not willing to lead debates. We saw at the last election, he was willing to lead debates. There's a reason why Labor is not taking a retirees tax, is not taking a housing tax to the election, is not going with the completely radical climate policy that they had at the last election. And there's a reason why after the last election, the Queensland government quickly approved things like Adani, because Scott Morrison was prepared to enter the debate. And I could say the same thing for our opposition leader as well. So I think it's a sad state of affairs we're seeing in policy debate in political life at the moment.
Richard, do you agree?
I don't mind that the Prime Minister changes his mind when he's wrong. I mean, obviously he went to the last election saying that electric cars would ruin the weekend and tackling climate change would ruin the economy. And then because he smelt the wind, so to speak, he's completely changed his mind. And now, of course, he supports net zero and pretends that he never mentioned electric cars ruining the weekend. The problem isn't that the Prime Minister won't ever lead a debate. It's that he will only lead a debate when he's leading a debate against people with no power. So early on in the crisis, of course, he sided with Clive Palmer and tried to take High Court action against Western Australia. High Court action against Western Australia to keep its borders closed. And now, of course, he's flipped, as he always does. When he sees how he's going to lose, he flips teams, and now he's siding with the West Australian Premier. So he does lead debate against people without any power. But when he realises he's up against it, that's when he flips.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.